Hello, I'm Dr. Kenneth Goldberg, and I'm the author of The Homework Trap: How to Save the Sanity of Parents, Students, and Teachers. 2 days ago, there was an article in Education Week Teacher called "To Pass or Not to Pass: The End of Year Moral Dilemma." It was written by a high school teacher, Colette Marie Bennett, and she poses a situation with a student who has not done the assignments all year long, but from her classroom discussion, it is very clear that she understands the material and has learned quite a bit. And the question is, should the child be passed, even though the numerical grade goes below a passing grade? And the article was written to invite commentary, and there were 13 thoughtful comments to this article. And I was impressed because the comments did not necessarily just say, screw her, she has to do the work, or you got to give her a break. They were thoughtful responses. I have my own response, and it differs from what other people have said. And I'd like to make it clear that I am a psychologist, not a teacher, and that I am a clinical psychologist with a general practice, not a child psychologist or a school psychologist. So I do look at the situation from a different point of view. My work as a psychologist has included work with children, it's included work with parents, but it's also included work with adults. And probably more work with adults than with children, and a lot of work with adults who are disabled and who, for one reason or another, really cannot function. So I look at the situation not in terms of this child and this individual's grade at this high school level, but I look at it as a situation that it affects all teachers at all grades, that there is probably no teacher who does not find every year one or two or three students who simply have potential, have the capacity to learn, even do learn, but simply do not get the work done. And often the work that doesn't get done is more of the homework, the stuff that's assigned, rather than the work that goes on in school. And so I see these kids, adults, I see them in the elementary school, middle school, high school, and then what happens to them in later life. So I'd like to give a lifespan explanation of what happens to these children, because the point of education is to prepare children for the future, not just what they do today. And a lot of our efforts in dealing with children is, what do we do today? What do we grade them today? What grade do they end up getting? Did they get this assignment done? How do we get them to get this assignment done? And we overlook the longer principle, is what is actually happening as a lifelong process. Here is what I have identified as happens with homework trapped children. And it may or may not be the case with this particular individual referred to in the article in her high school years. It starts in elementary school, where assignments are not getting done and the parent gets called in. And at that point you have just one teacher. And what is happening is that you have what I like to call an under the radar learning problem. It need not be a problem sufficient enough to be called a learning disability. However, what is happening is that the child is having trouble getting the work done in a reasonable amount of time. As with every individual characteristic, children are able to produce their homework at different paces. You run a race. You have a kid who's at the front of the race. You have the bunch in the middle of the pack. You got some kids tailing behind. Any skill, you will always have variations. We call it the normal curve, where the bulk of people are in the middle, and then you begin to have some who are particularly exceptional and some who are weaker. This is true with every human characteristic. So what happens is the pace at which an individual can work varies. So a child in elementary school, these children will vary in pace. And in school, because the school starts and stops with a clock, differences in pace don't really affect the child's experience that greatly. You do have that child who's always looking up and seeing the other children are done. However, that child is still going to leave the school at the same time. At home, you have the 10-minute assignment takes a different amount of time for different kids, as long as the whole assignment has to be done. And for some kids, that 10-minute assignment takes 20, the 20 takes 40, and the 40 takes 80. And what ends up happening is for the slower processing child, the slower working child, it becomes harder for that child to get the work done. And because it becomes so important that the work gets done in everybody's mind, parents and teachers come together. When parents and teachers come together in the name of trying to help that child get the work done, all that does is it creates an experience of being ganged up on. Parents and teachers may not mean to gang up on the child, but the child experiences that child is being ganged up on. So that child ends up finding defensive strategies to deal with it. And those strategies are the same strategies that we consider bad behavior. The reality is what the child can't do is get the work done in a reasonable period of time. The child might be able to get the work done if the child just works on and on and on, but it does mean that the child loses out on play. The child may lose out on creative activities, particularly if the child is a hands-on child, and the child is not able to do the same things peers do. So children who are slow processing tend to take one of two tacks. One of them is they're the more social, interactive, popular kids, and they will end up ditching their homework for the socialization. Then you have the more isolated, private kids. Sometimes kids nowadays, we think of them, start to diagnose more and more of them as having Asperger's, which they may or may not have. So those kids are not that adept with socialization, so they may stay in and do the homework at the loss of social learning. But one way or another, the one option this child doesn't have is to get all the work done. So in elementary school, you begin to build up this negative pattern in which the child comes home, experiences a full court press. Parents and teachers are joining together to make sure the work gets done. The child can't do it in a reasonable period of time, and the child either does it at loss of other things the child needs to do, or the child doesn't do it at loss of grades and becoming defined as a bad child. When the child hits middle school, what happens is that child is faced with multiple teachers. So the child inevitably will start to do all the work for some of the teachers and none of the work for the other teachers. And for a while, maybe for a few weeks or so, the child will actually feel good because he's getting stuff done. But inevitably, the demand to get all the work done for all the teachers crashes in on that child. And then, like a house of cards, one by one, the child starts giving up the work for all the teachers and becomes viewed as a significant behavioral problem. And all along, the child is losing the value of having different environments, home and school, that provide different things for that child, and the child losing the respite function of home, and the child losing the good feelings with the parents of just coming home to a safe place. When the child gets into high school, you're now starting to hit a point where the academics are more important than just the general experience. Whereas in middle school, the multiple teachers may have worked together in teams. In high school, the teachers are starting to work in departments. So they're beginning to focus on what the departmental expectations are, the expectations of their subject, not as much as a collective group of teachers working together to make sure, that the kids are getting, at least some controls or balance on how much work is required. So then they get up to high school level where this particular article is focused on. And what ends up happening there is you have a lifelong experience of strategies that end up acting out and end up avoiding the work. And they may continue. So when this teacher talks about this student in this particular article, she is dealing with a student that has a whole history. Now, it's possible that student is just having a bad year or a bad subject or something's happening then and there that's isolated from what happened before. But for many students, what the teacher is seeing is a culmination of years of homework pressure, homework resistance, and learned responses, a learned ability, even though the child is interested in school, a learned ability to work one's way around the assignments as opposed to with the assignments. Now, the biggest risk in high school is separation from social life, because high school is the center of social life for high school age kids. Up to, say, 8th grade, there's a lot of community-based activities. This is particularly true for athletes who, up to 8th grade, may may have a lot of good connections with peer groups, but what ends up happening is they're having the good connections because even though they're struggling at school, they have town-based athletic activities. Now they hit high school where athletics is primarily centered around high school, and they may get removed from those activities because of athletic eligibility. In fact, this could happen with any types of school-based activities, although athletics stands apart because of our tendency to not allow the children to play unless they make grades. But what eventually happens is when these student athletes get pulled apart from the high school, they lose from high school sports. Rather than the threat of losing high school sports getting them to get good grades, what ends up happening is the separation drives them to undesirable peers. They had been friends with the kids that are motivated, doing reasonably well, who have a future ahead of them, and now they've lost that contact. This drives them to other kids, and then you run into the risk of highly negative behaviors. These kids are more prone to get involved in irresponsible sex, drug abuse, criminal behavior, and just general acting out. They're at more risk of dropping out of school. Now, what happens in adult life, and this is where I often see them because I work with people that are disabled who are trying to get back into the workforce, and I'm asked to do psychological evaluations on them. What ends up happening is these individuals are terrified about school. What they've really learned all these years is to fear education, not to embrace education. So now maybe this individual has done reasonably well. Maybe the person has become a carpenter, and he's just gotten turned off to school. It was a nightmare for him. It was not a good experience, but he's become a carpenter. Now he's hurt his back. I'm a 65-year-old man. In all honesty, I would have been disabled for numbers of years by now if I was a carpenter, if I had to work in a physically taxing way. But this individual is now in their 40s or so, maybe 50s. They've hurt their back and they can't do what they did before. And they're reasonably bright people, and their option is to go to school. And you can see that they have the theoretical potential for school. But what happens is that they are just terrified because they have learned to believe that they can't do it in school. And this can have a tremendously negative effect on their capacity to pick themselves up by the bootstraps and do well. So the point of this video is I want to make it clear that there are long-term effects, and that whatever grade you're at and whatever decision you're making, you're part of a process. As I said, the article that I'm referring to involves a high school student. And for high school students, it's a little different because at this point the individual is more independent, is the one dealing directly with the teacher. The parents are a little less involved in what is actually happening to that child. But often this is an accumulation of negative experiences and learned resistance to school, that our systems are teaching the child to resist school. So what should you do? Should you fail the child? Should you pass the child? Well, my general sense is that you don't want the child to have a negative experience. You don't want to throw out the baby with the bathwater. You don't want to allow your systems to cause children to cause children to be compromised later in life because they've learned to dislike education. And hopefully I can, from my perspective, expand the discussion from just what's happening now to an understanding of what was happening before the child ever got to your class and what possibly can happen as the child moves into adult life. Thank you very much.